Chapter Who are they?
Subsequently, in the 3 days I spent with Anastasia, observing this strange young woman living alone in the remote Siberian taiga, I tried to understand the point of her way of life, and could not help but compare it with the way of life of people living in the large metropolises. Anastasia lives in the forest completely alone. She has no dwelling, she barely wears clothing, and she does not put up stores of food. She is the descendant of people who have lived here for millennia and were the representatives of an essentially different civilization. She and her kind have been preserved to our day, in my opinion, with the help of a very wise decision, perhaps the only correct decision. They blend in among us, outwardly trying not to stand out in any way from ordinary people, and where they have their permanent residence, they blend with nature. Finding the place where they live is hard. Man's presence in such a place can be determined only by the fact that it seems better tended, handsomer, like Anastasia's taiga glade, for example. Anastasia was born here and is an inalienable part of nature. Unlike the great hermits we know, she did not retreat to the forest just for a while, as they did. She was born in the taiga and only visits our world briefly. A perfectly simple explanation was found for the seemingly mystic phenomenon when that powerful fear suddenly flooded me and I lost consciousness in my attempt to overpower Anastasia. Man has tamed the cat, dog, elephant, tiger, and eagle, and here everything around has been tamed. And this everything cannot allow anything bad to happen to her. Anastasia told me that when she was born and before she was even a year old, her mother might leave her alone for a whole day. And you didn't starve to death. The tiger hermit first looked at me in amazement, and then replied,
Vladimir, the world has created from the beginning in such a way that man would have no need to waste the energy of his thoughts on where to get food or what kind. Everything around matures in the sequence man requires. You have to eat as you breathe, paying no attention to your nourishment and undistracted from the most important thing. The Creator laid this problem on others so that man could live and carry out his purpose.
Do you mean to say that the hundreds of millions of people of the civilized world do not need to be going to work every day to eat properly?
The way of life they've chosen forces them to go to work.
What does their way of life have to do with this? The way of life of peasants and farmers is different from a city dweller's, but they too worked from morning till night to feed their family. And for you to get just one cedar nut, for example, you must have to exert quite a lot of effort. Over there, the cedar cones on the tree are high above the ground, a good 10 meters up.
Yes, it is high. I hadn't thought of that before. I'd always done it the way my grandfather taught me.
At these words, Anastasia lifted her right hand and snapped her fingers. A few minutes later, there was a fluffy red squirrel next to Anastasia, who was sitting on the grass. The little beast was standing on its hind legs holding a cedar cone in its paws. Anastasia snapped her fingers a second time, paying no attention to the squirrel and continuing the conversation. The little beast began quickly husking the cone, taking the cedar nut out of it and putting them in a pile. When Anastasia clicked her fingers a third time, the squirrel shelled one nut and jumped smartly onto her palm. Anastasia raised the little beast's face to her mouth. The squirrel passed the kernel of the cedar nut from his mouth to hers, jumped off her hand and started shelling the next nut. Standing on the ground, holding cones in their front paws, were more than a dozen other squirrels, and their numbers quickly multiplied. Anastasia slapped the grass a meter away from where I was sitting. All the squirrels started husking the cones and piling the nuts at the indicated spot. Once done with a cone, each squirrel went off for another. A few minutes later, a pile of cedar nuts was towering in front of me. At first, this scene seemed fantastic, but then I recalled how at Novosibirsk's Akademgorodok, whose housing was built in the middle of a pine forest, there were lots of squirrels, which got used to people. The squirrels begged for food from the strolling residents and actually got angry when they weren't given anything. Here I was simply observing the reverse process. In the normal world, our world, everything's arranged differently. Just try to click your fingers at a commercial stall, Anastasia. You could beat a drum and they wouldn't give you anything. But you say, the Creator solved everything.
Whose fault is it if man decided to change the Creator's work? For better or worse, try to understand it for yourself, Vladimir.
This was my dialogue with her on the problem of nourishment. Anastasia's position is simple. It's sinful to waste thought on what was initially offered in abundance. The way of life in man's artificial world creates problems. It turned out that the hermit Anastasia, residing in the taiga, gave no thought to her nourishment and wasted neither physical nor intellectual energy on it. At the same time, she had top-quality, organic nourishment that was ideally balanced for her organism. So we, in the civilized world, it turned out, not only had to think about nourishment but also work for it from morning to night, meanwhile getting food of highly dubious quality. We were used to our world and called it civilized. But hadn't man's modern civilization forgotten about the existence of another life, in harmony with nature? What heights could man have reached had he devoted the millennia of his development to the natural rather than the artificial world? We know many examples from literature, the press, and television programs of infants who have fallen accidentally into the power of wild nature, being suckled by wolves. Here, generations of people had lived continuously in harmony with their environment, and their relationship with the animal world was different from ours. Furthermore, their organism may have had different properties. I asked Anastasia, "Why aren't you cold while I'm wearing a jacket?"
Because the organism of people who wrap up in clothing, who hide from the cold and the heat in shelters, steadily loses its ability to adapt to changes in its environment. I haven't lost this property of the human organism, so I don't particularly need clothing.
Chapter A Forest Bedroom.
I had no gear with me for sleeping in the wild forest. Anastasia put me to bed in a dugout lair. Exhausted after our difficult journey, I fell asleep hard and fast. When I awoke, I had a sensation of bliss and comfort, as if I'd been lying on a magnificent, comfortable bed. The lair, or dugout, was spacious and lined with tiny, fluffy cedar twigs and dried grass, which filled the space with a pleasant fragrance. Stretching, I flung my arms out to either side. One hand touched a furry hide, and I immediately made a note that Anastasia hunted in some fashion. I moved closer to the fur, pressed my back to its warmth, and decided to doze a little longer. Anastasia was standing at the entrance of my taiga bedroom. When she saw I'd awakened, she immediately said,
May today's day come to you with good, Vladimir, and may you meet it with your own good. Only don't be frightened, please.
She clapped her hands on the fur. I realized in horror that this was no hide. A bear began to crawl out of the den cautiously. Receiving an approving slap from Anastasia, the bear licked her hand and began hobbling away from the glade. It turned out that Anastasia had put sleeping herbs at the head of my bed and made the bear lie next to me so I wouldn't be cold. She herself had slept curled up outside at the entrance. How could you have done such a thing, Anastasia? He might have ripped me to shreds or crushed me.
It's not a he, it's a she, a female bear. It is very docile and could not have done anything bad to you. It gets great pleasure from being given a task and carrying it out. It didn't budge the whole night. It poked its nose into my feet and fell blissfully still. It just shuddered a little when you flung your arms around in your sleep and hit it on the back.
Chapter Anastasia's Morning.
When twilight falls, Anastasia goes to bed in one of the shelters made by the inhabitants of the forest, usually a lair. When it's warm, she might sleep right on the grass. The first thing she does when she awakens is rejoice wildly at the rising sun, the new shoots appearing on the branches, and the new sprouts emerging from the earth. She touches them, strokes them, sometimes sets something aright. Then she runs over to the small trees and slaps their trunk. Something like dust or dew showers down on her from the shaking crown. Then she lies down on the grass, and for 5 minutes or so blissfully stretches and bends. Her entire body becomes covered with what seems like a moist cream. She takes off at a run, jumps into the small lake, splashes, and dives in, dives wonderfully. Her relations with the animal world around her resemble man's relations with domestic animals. During her morning routine, many of them observe Anastasia. They don't approach, but all she has to do is look in their direction and make a barely noticeable summoning gesture, and the happy animal is off running toward her feet. One morning I saw her acting the fool, playing with a wolf cub as if it were a pet dog. Anastasia slapped the cub on its shoulder and swiftly ran off. The cub ran to catch up, and when they were nearly even, Anastasia suddenly took a leap as she ran, jumped and pushed off a tree trunk with 2 feet, and took off in another direction. The cub kept running past the tree, out of inertia, turned and raced to catch up with the laughing Anastasia. Anastasia doesn't give a moment's thought to the problem of clothing and nourishment. Most of the time she walks around half or entirely naked. She eats cedar nuts, some herbs, berries, and mushrooms. She eats only dried mushrooms. She herself never gathers mushrooms or nuts and provisions and puts up no stores, even for winter. Everything is prepared by the many squirrels that inhabit these parts. There is nothing surprising in the fact that the squirrels put up stores of food for winter. They do this everywhere, following their natural instinct. What struck me was something else. At the snap of Anastasia's fingers, the squirrels close to her raced to jump into her outstretched hand and give her a shelled nut. And when Anastasia slapped her knee, or the earth, the squirrels made a sound, as if summoning, informing the others, and started dragging out dried mushrooms and other stores and piling them in front of her on the grass. And they did it with tremendous satisfaction, or so it seemed to me. I thought she had trained them, but Anastasia said their actions seemed instinctive, and the mother squirrel herself taught her little squirrels by example.
Maybe one of my distant ancestors did train them, but more than likely this is just their predestination. For winter, each squirrel puts away stores that are several times more than it can eat itself.
When asked how she didn't freeze in winter without appropriate clothing, Anastasia answered with a question.
In your world, don't you have examples of man's abilities to withstand cold without using clothing?
Then I remembered the book by Porfiry Ivanov, who went around in any cold wearing underpants and barefoot. The book also described how the fascists, wishing to test the endurance of this unusual Russian man, doused him with water when it was 20 below zero and drove him around naked on a motorcycle. In her early childhood, besides her mother's milk, Anastasia could use the milk of various animals. They freely lowered their teats to her. She made absolutely no cult whatsoever of food, never sat down especially to eat, picked berries and plant shoots as she went, and continued to go about her business. By the end of 3 days with her, I could no longer treat her as I had when we first met. After all I had seen and heard, Anastasia had become for me a creature, not a beast because her intellect is quite high, but her memory. Her memory is such that she, of course, forgets nothing she has ever heard or seen. Sometimes her abilities seem to lie beyond ordinary comprehension, but this attitude toward her caused her much grief and distress. Unlike people we know with unusual abilities who wrap themselves in an aura of mystery and exceptionality, she was constantly trying to explain and reveal the mechanism of her abilities, to prove that there was nothing supernatural about them or her, that she was a person, a woman, and she was constantly asking me to be conscious of that. I tried to do so as I sought an explanation for what was so unusual. I tried to consider it rationally. The mind of someone from our civilization tries by every means possible to arrange his daily life, obtain nourishment, and satisfy his sexual instincts. Anastasia spent no time on this at all. People who end up in a situation like the Likovs are also forced to worry constantly about feeding themselves and arranging shelter. Nature does not help them to the degree it does Anastasia, nor do all the various tribes living far from civilization have this contact. Anastasia explained this by saying that their intentions were not sufficiently pure. Nature and the animal world sense this.
End of chapter. Join us for the next segment of Anastasia, Book 1 of the Ringing Cedars series, Anastasia's Ray.